WSM Television, Color 4, Nashville, Tennessee.
And about 500,000 for Wallace. 42%, 34%, and 23%. Chet?
The following states have now gone Republican or for Nixon: Kentucky, Vermont, and Kansas, with a total of 19 electoral votes. West Virginia has gone Democratic or for Humphrey for a total of 7 electoral votes. Alabama and Mississippi have gone Wallace for a total of 17 electoral votes. Let me call your attention to this map. These states that you see on the map are states where the polls are still open. Voting is still in progress. We urge you again, if you live in one of these states, and if you have not yet voted, do so, go to the polls, and exercise your franchise of an American citizen. David?
Now let's look at Ohio. In Ohio, we have 6% of the vote now. Nixon is in the lead with 48%. Humphrey second with 40, and George Wallace 11%. Kentucky, 85% of the vote of Kentucky is in now. We projected the winner there some time ago, an hour or more, to be Nixon. And that's we projected 43%. He now has 44. In Kansas, 3% of the vote is in, and we have projected Nixon to be the winner there with 52%. In New Hampshire, 3% of the vote is in, and 3% in New Hampshire, a small state, is not very much, as you see, not very many votes. Nixon is in the lead, but we still don't have enough to say anything much, certainly anything conclusive about it. We'll be back in a moment.
Due to relaxed requirements for absentee ballots and the large number of servicemen in Vietnam and Europe, requests for such ballots this year have been at record levels. Both major parties have been courting an estimated 2 million eligible military voters. It's not possible to estimate the overall absentee vote because many states don't keep accurate totals of them. And in most states, absentee ballots are counted along with the regular votes. By the way, some of these ballots have to be counted tonight. Others may be counted several days later. In the state of Washington alone, there are an estimated 100,000 absentees. New Jersey has an estimated 112,000 absentee ballots. We know that there are at least 500,000 absentee ballots throughout the nation to be counted sometime before the books are finally closed on this election, and indeed there may be more than that. My attention has been called to the state of Tennessee. 39% of the vote is now in, and NBC News projects that Nixon has carried the state of Tennessee with 41% of the vote. To Sander Van Oker. Senator?
Chet, one of the races we're paying special attention tonight to is the Senate race in the state of Ohio between former Cincinnati Congressman John Gilligan, who defeated the incumbent Frank Lausche in the Democratic primary, and State Attorney General William Saxby, who now leads, as you can see. And why we're paying special attention to this is the role that labor is or is not playing in behalf of Gilligan. You see, the AFL-CIO didn't endorse Gilligan until September 27th, even though it gave him very great support against Lausche in the primary. And the reason it didn't was his lukewarm attitude toward Vice President Humphrey before the convention. He didn't endorse him until afterward. And his work in behalf of a dovish plank at Chicago on the subject of Vietnam. Allegedly, the AFL-CIO didn't give Gilligan enough money, gave him reportedly $100,000. He expected twice that much, and he had to cut down on his television time, which he didn't have to do in the primary when he defeated Lausche. The trouble is that in the state... Yeah.
Go ahead. Well, go ahead. Wasn't Gilligan saying in Chicago that if they nominated Humphrey, it would make it very difficult for him to defeat him?
That was the whole point. The people like Gilligan, Bill Clark running against Dirksen, others like them in the platform committee, they said we can't go home if we don't go home with a peace plan. And when he went home without a peace plan, he angered labor. He didn't satisfy the McCarthy supporters in the state. And if you don't have organized labor behind you and you're a Democrat in Ohio, you're in trouble, because when organized labor gets behind a candidate, as they did behind Stephen Young, you remember in '58, opposing John Bricker, who voted for right-to-work laws, then you as a Democrat are in deep trouble. And especially in the state of Ohio, because William Saxby was the only major Republican in the state in 1958 who opposed right-to-work. So it's a great question about how much support Gilligan will get from labor. If he doesn't get a great deal, then he's going to be in deep trouble in Ohio.
Sandy, just glancing at your board, I can't quite see all of it, but it seems to me the only one still in doubt and on which we do not have a projected conclusion is Indiana again. What do you show there?
Indiana, we have the Republican, William Ruckelhaus, the majority leader of the House, with a pretty good lead over the incumbent Birch Bayh. And I suppose also you could say it's a great question in that state what organized labor is doing for Birch Bayh, because organized labor matters way up there in Lake County. And maybe if those voters, we don't know yet, are going for George Wallace, I'm just projecting this may be hurting Birch Bayh. I think John Chancellor has some more information on what labor is doing in the presidential contest in Ohio. Is that right, John?
Yes, I do, and it's quite interesting. Vice President Humphrey is receiving 51% now by our calculations, and that's rough. He's receiving about half of the Union vote in Ohio, compared to about a third of the Union vote for Nixon, and what we calculate now at 17% for Wallace. And this is very interesting. Wallace should have done better than that, but also Humphrey, according to the close connection between organized labor and Democrats in Ohio, should have done better. 50% of the vote is not as good as Lyndon Johnson's 3/4 of the labor vote, 78% in the final reckoning in Ohio in 1964. Also, Nixon, with about a third of the labor vote, is doing much better than the Republicans did in a two-way contest in Ohio 4 years ago. In that contest, running against President Johnson, the Republican Goldwater got 22% of the labor vote. Now, there are many complicated factors involving in this, but one of the suggested indications here in these figures is that organized labor coming out on behalf of Hubert Humphrey against George Wallace may in fact have won some votes in labor for Nixon, which is quite interesting. The turnout rate, the number of labor families that went to the polls today is, according to our estimates, a good bit higher than it was in 1964. So while the situation is mixed, Humphrey is not doing as well as the Democrats did 4 years ago in Ohio, but neither is George Wallace doing as well as he had hoped in that state. Nixon, as a matter of fact, is doing a little bit better in some Democratic areas than anybody had expected him to, and the Republican voters there who deserted the party, the Goldwater Republican Party 4 years ago, seem to be returning to the Nixon party now. This is, I think, you'll see a good bit of this tonight. Vermont, traditionally a Republican state, deserted the Republican Party in 1964 and has returned to the fold this time. Now here's Frank McGee.
Republicans had been expected to win some governor's races where popular Democrats decided either to retire or to seek another office, and that is happening tonight in Vermont. NBC News has projected a winner in the state of Vermont, the Republican Dean C. Davis, who currently is garnering 59% of the vote to the Democratic John Daly's 41%. Our projection is that when all the tabulating is done, Davis will be the winner by 58%. Interestingly enough, that's the same margin by which Nixon is currently carrying the state. Davis is 67 years old. He's chairman of the board of the National Life Insurance Company. He hasn't held an elective office in 30 years, and he's an old-line conservative. He said his recipe for the state of Vermont would be a little bit of fiscal conservatism, a little bit of economy in state expenditures, a little bit of slowing down, he said, to permit growth on the part of the state. He will take the place of Philip Hoff, the Democratic governor who retired after 3 two-year terms. It's a tough loss for the Democrat, John Daly, who at 45 years old is the father of 11 children. Had he won, he would have been the new champion in that department, surpassing New Jersey's Governor Richard Hughes, the current title holder, with 10 children. David?
Thank you. NBC News projects Nixon the winner in Florida, in the presidential election in Florida, with 40% of the vote. It turned out to be pretty close, as forecast. Nixon has 38% in the votes we have already counted. We project that he will have 40 when they are all counted. Now we're going to look at 4 other states, beginning with Illinois. Illinois hasn't been closed very long, but we now have a few figures from there. Just a few. Nixon is ahead, but the figures are so few in number that they don't mean much. South Carolina, 5% in from South Carolina. That is Senator Strom Thurmond's home state. He has been working avidly, not to say eagerly, for Nixon, but in his own state at this early hour. It may not turn out that way at the finish, but at this early hour, George Wallace is first, Humphrey is second, and Nixon is third. In Arkansas, less than 1%, hardly worth spending any time on that. But anyway, there are first figures from Arkansas. There's too few to mean anything. In Georgia, 3% is in. Wallace is well in the lead in Georgia at this early hour, 52%, 13,000 votes, more than his two opponents combined. Chet?
Some more returns from various states. Indiana, for example. State of Indiana, 10% of the vote is now in. Nixon in the lead with 56% of the vote, Humphrey with 33%, and Wallace with 10% of the vote. State of Virginia, 7% of the vote is now in. Nixon in the lead with 39%, Wallace in second place with 31%, and Humphrey a close third with 29% of the vote. North Carolina, 6% of the vote is now in. Nixon again leading, but narrowly, with 33%. Humphrey with and Wallace in second place. Oh, let's start all over. Wallace leading with 35%. Nixon trailing closely with 33%. And again, Humphrey trailing closely with 31%. Tennessee, it is our projected conclusion that Nixon has carried the state of Tennessee. And by the way, the totals now in the electoral vote are as follows. Nixon now has, on a projected basis, 44 electoral votes. Humphrey has 7, and Wallace has 17. We'll be back in just a moment.
We're back. Let's take a look at Indiana first. In Indiana, with 10% of the vote in, we have projected Nixon the winner in Indiana with 48%. He has 56% now. We project that when they're all counted, he will win Indiana, 13 electoral votes there, with 48% of the vote. That means that Nixon now has won 5 states with a total of 44 electoral votes. He still has a long way to go, 270 it takes to win. Now let's look at the popular vote total. Nixon is in the lead with more than 1 million votes, 42%. Humphrey second with 34. George Wallace at this hour a strong third with 24. The others are Dick Gregory, Cleaver, McCarthy write-ins, and others. And at this hour they have 5,600, less than 1%. To Ed Newman. Ed?
Well, at this moment, David, about 40% of the House races have been decided. 163, as you can see. The Democrats have won 96 of them, the Republicans 67. And it may appear to be extraordinary that not one of those 163 seats that have been decided has changed hands. In itself, it suggests that there has been no big swing either way. But the fact is that almost without exception, these were safe or relatively safe seats for the party that holds them now. And probably it would have taken a very, very large swing in the vote to shift party control of any of them. We still have to wait for some key races in a state like New Jersey. New Jersey is a state with 15 congressmen. The Democrats have so far won 4. The Republicans have won 4. No change. We have to wait for key districts in Pennsylvania, which has 27 congressmen. The Democrats have won 9. The Republicans 12. Again, no change. In fact, with all these safe seats remaining safe, it appears that none of the House leaders from either party will lose today. Speaker John McCormick, Democratic leader Carl Albert of Oklahoma, Gerald Ford of Michigan, the Republican leader, Leslie Aarons of Illinois, the Republican whip, Melvin Laird of Wisconsin, the chairman of the Republican Conference. Hale Boggs of Louisiana, the Democratic whip, did have a pretty tough fight. He is expected, however, to make it. Now, perhaps there must be one change in the committee chairmanship in the House. That's in the House Committee on Un-American Activities. The current chairman, Edwin Willis of Louisiana, was upset in the primary, so he will not be back in January. If Richard Icord, a Democrat of Missouri, wins his seat today, holds his seat today, he will be the new chairman. Now to Sander Van Oker.
We have another projected winner in a Senate contest, and that is in South Carolina, where NBC News is projecting that the incumbent, seeking his second term, Ernest Hollings, will win that race with 57% of the vote over his Republican opponent, Marshall Parker. That race was thought to be somewhat closer than it turned out to be because it was felt that Hollings had disappointed many of the Negro voters who first put him across when he ran for the Senate, but apparently he's doing very well, and we have projected him as the winner, Ernest Hollings, the incumbent. In New Hampshire, with early returns in, the incumbent Senator Norris Cotton is running, and these are early returns, quite a bit ahead of Governor John King, the Democrat. Governor King was first a supporter of the Johnson administration on Vietnam. Then he called for a bombing halt. Cotton has been holding pretty firm to a tough view on Vietnam, and it looks now that Governor King, who's been a very popular governor up there, is running pretty well behind with 5% of the votes in. Over in the close contest in Indiana, the incumbent Birch Bayh, seeking his second term, is running behind the Republican William Ruckelshaus. The first S in his name is pronounced, it's silent. William Ruckelshaus, who's the majority leader. He's just 35 years old. Bayh is 40, so that's a spirited contest now between two young men. Over in Ohio, there is another close contest between former Cincinnati Congressman John Gilligan, who is now trailing the State Attorney General, William Saxby. So far as we know, the expected heavy Democratic vote from Cuyahoga County has either not started to come in or is just trickling in at this point, but we'll be paying close attention to this close race. David?
At 8:20, the NBC News projection desk still sees the possibility of a close presidential race. There is nothing in the national popular vote total so far to show a big victory for either candidate. Nixon is in the lead in the popular vote, but the big industrial states of the North, where Hubert Humphrey's strength lies, have not yet been heard from. The percentage of vote for Wallace seems a little high, but perhaps because of the early closing time of states in the Deep South, where he is strongest. We'll be back in a moment.
All right, where are we now? Let's take a look at several states. Mississippi, for example. We have projected a winner in Mississippi. It is George Wallace. And our projection is that he will carry 60% of the vote. In Vermont, the projected winner is Nixon with 54% of the vote. In West Virginia, the projected winner is Humphrey with 54% of the vote. And in Florida, our projected winner is Nixon with 40% of the vote. Nixon has now carried 6 states with a total of 57 electoral votes. Wallace has carried 2 with a total of 17 electoral votes. Humphrey has carried the state of West Virginia with 7 electoral votes. Now to John Chancellor.
George Wallace may have done well in Mississippi, and that was no surprise, but what must make his people unhappy tonight is that they did not do well in Kentucky and Tennessee, and they are not doing well in Florida. George Wallace is currently 3rd in Florida with about a third of that vote, a little less, tallied so far. It's interesting to look at the Wallace vote as we've been able to tabulate it here on our RCA computers in Kentucky. In the Louisville area, which is traditionally Republican, Wallace is getting about 16% of the vote, about the same that he's doing all across the state. In the poor farming region in the western part of Kentucky, Wallace is getting about 29% of the vote. That's no surprise. But in the Cumberland Mountains, which is an old Republican territory, part of Appalachia, Wallace has dropped down to about 14%. of the vote, which is well below his showing all across Kentucky. And that means that George Wallace is not doing terribly well with the Hill people in the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky, who have, as I say, been traditionally Republican. But all the indications from his candidacy this year seem to be that he would pick up votes with these people, and he's not doing very well. In the rest of Kentucky, where the votes add up to more than half the state's votes, Wallace is getting a little bit more than 16% of the vote. And when you look at the difference between the cities, the suburbs, the small cities, and the rural areas, Wallace is doing his best in the suburbs, with about almost 20% of the vote we've been able to calculate so far in Kentucky for Wallace is coming from the suburbs. He's doing most poorly in the metropolitan areas, and of course that includes some Negro voters in Kentucky. He's down to 13%, and not enough in the countryside itself. So it would seem that with the suburbs, the voters there having indicated to all of us all year long that they feel that law and order, even though they may not have much crime themselves, that law and order is a very vigorous issue with them, that they may have responded to what George Wallace had to say. But he did not do as well as he expected it to elsewhere in Kentucky, and that's where George Wallace stands in that state now.